I've never played more than a few minutes of Paperboy. I know many consider it an arcade classic, but the most I know is you spend the game riding your bike along your paper route and hurling newspapers on front porches while trying to avoid the occasional obstacle. I vaguely remember what I played of it being pretty fun, while also feeling like I understand the lack of itch for developers to do a modern iteration of that gameplay formula. It doesn't strike me as a concept with a lot of potential, but hey, budding game developers, prove me wrong. Or, at least, if you're going to try to spin Paperboy off into something familiar but new, try not to make it literally one of the worst games I've ever tortured myself to finish. Try not to be Death Noodle Delivery. While I intend to make this review very entertaining for you, I first wish to give a quick call out to our Patreon in the link below, where you can help support us in bringing a voice to the voiceless and gain cool perks like Discord community access and free games depending on your membership tier. It's hard to know where to start with Death Noodle Delivery. There are just so many options and it's hard to pick one, you know? But after much deliberation, let us start with its length. My total playtime on Death Noodle Delivery clocked in at 2.4 hours from beginning to end. Of that 2.4 hours, the amount of time filled with actual content feels somewhere in the, I'm gonna very generously say 45-minute range. So let's talk about what I spent the rest of the time on. For completeness sake, about 15 minutes or so was actually spent totally idle as I scribbled down notes or lines of dialogue so I wouldn't forget to include them in my review. Lines like, "Finally at home, can't wait to drop this backpack and take a shit," or "Damn, I almost died tonight. Now I really have to take a shit," or my personal favorite, "This backpack is a real pain in the dick." I'm really not being facetious here or exaggerating. This is the actual dialogue in Death Noodle Delivery. And look, I'm not above a poop joke. I'm really not. But the delivery here is worse than a DoorDash driver who takes your food to the wrong neighborhood and eats half the fries on the way. You now might be like, wait, Mike, I thought you implied this game is like some kind of new Paperboy. Why is the Paperboy cursing and talking about his bowels? That's a great question, and one only answerable by understanding the rest of Death Noodle Delivery's absolutely abysmal narrative. You play as Jimmy, a noodle delivery driver, noodles, newspapers, whatever, it's Paperboy, in an egregiously cliche cyberpunk world with some visual design I actually really want to talk about but can't quite sidetrack there yet. It's a world where everyone is miserable and nobody is valued, and you use cats as explosive bombs for some reason. As in, pressing a button fires off a cat that then explodes on your enemies, and this is one of your most core abilities in the entire game. I feel like this was an attempt to be kind of silly, but I just don't get it exactly. And it's another example of this overall theme where, okay, no, sorry, I'm not there yet. This is just like the visual design thing. I'll totally get there, just not yet. Anyway, the story. The story of Death Noodle Delivery takes up far more of its runtime than you could possibly imagine. Of the 2.4 hours, with some occasional stopping and staring considered, seemingly at least half of it was story. Generally, the extent of the gameplay in these sequences is controlling Jimmy directly, a Jimmy who is extremely keen on shuffling through his apartment complex like a zombie too hungover to be that into brains right now. Jimmy's entire personality is being tired and talking about shitting and watching porn, so I suppose to be thematically consistent, the developers ensured that he doesn't seem to know how to walk like a normal person. You'll shamble to and from the various departments in his complex, talking to vividly imagined characters such as cranky guy always yelling something onto his phone, a neighbor whose recurring gag is refusing to let Jimmy use his toilet, or my favorite, a drug dealer who is very helpful before telling you to fuck off after you mention how uncharacteristically kind he's being. Near the end, spoilers aside, the game devolves into a slurry of pseudo-philosophical nonsense, and at one point even seemed to make up a word that didn't exist to describe something. It does nothing engaging, its characters say nothing interesting, and it all yet again reminds me of that overarching connection that I still can't talk about yet, but soon though. I have a very hard time believing that Jimmy's mind-blowingly slow walk speed was not solely intended to pad out the game's meager hors d'oeuvres of content. And unless you find intrigue or humor in dialogue like, "I would love to log into cyberspace and look at lots and lots of boobs right now, but first I have to talk to my damn neighbor." Yeah, that's a real line of dialogue. A bunch of slow walking is all you're really gonna get. So let's get into the meat of those little hors d'oeuvres. The gameplay. Death Noodle Delivery's gameplay sequences consist of you riding Jimmy's hoverboard down a long road while tossing out noodle deliveries and avoiding obstacles that pop up in your way. Over the course of the game's first few levels, you get get the ability to dash forward, throw the aforementioned cat explosives out in front of you, or slow down time, an ability that has no reason to exist. What I began to find interesting though is not the fact that the item delivery gameplay feels somehow more simplistic than the original Paperboy, or the fact that the final level does away with the noodle delivery gameplay entirely for some reason, though that is interesting in its own right, but that there's really only one newspaper delivery level in the entire game, and you play it repeatedly. Sure, enemy placement is different. Yes, of course there are enemies. Who do you think you're throwing cat bombs at? And some things in the environment are changed, but structurally and visually, every delivery level is going through the same area, albeit extended bit by bit as the game progresses. So, not only is the amount of gameplay-focused content incredibly short, but it's doing slightly different variations of the same thing in the same place over and over until you're done. Okay, I guess to some degree that's not entirely fair to say though, because each gameplay sequence does have a part 2 of sorts where you try to make your way home after a shift, often while confronted with an enemy like a disgruntled pizza delivery guy looking to kill all other delivery people, apparently. This usually consists of dashing out of the way of his pizza van while strategically hitting him with feline explosives and noodle deliveries until you're done. These levels, too, are barely remixed versions of each other on the same boring highway, at least until a later game environment that honestly fares no better. And in true runtime padding tradition, the game also gets extremely difficult as it goes on, with a strict adherence to a one-hit and you're dead rule, no checkpoints in any of the sequences, and the fact that bombing enemies in front of you hardly feels like an exact science. Literally about 35 to 40 minutes of my entire playtime was spent on the final level, where I surely died at least 40 to 50 times navigating through dozens of aggressive enemies with bombs that felt like throwing lubed up water balloons. That's right, roughly a quarter of Death Noodle Delivery's already mercifully short time to see the credits roll was on the final level alone, an exercise in patience that will haunt me for reviews to come. Now that you know the variety of ways in which the 2.4 hours I played Death Noodle Stranding or whatever wasted my life, let's talk about the presentation. Sound design first, because that's easy. You'll frequently question whether it exists. A vast majority of objects in the game are missing sound effects. For example, in the highway chase sequences, there are no car sounds. In the story sequences, I've literally rewatched some of the footage I've recorded and had to scroll through several minutes to even find what seems like a sound effect. Characters don't speak or do so much as grunt, and most of the game takes place against a basic synthy soundtrack that usually just blends into the background like a self-conscious chameleon, and occasionally seems to loop its simple melodies so frequently that it becomes a bit of an ear bleeder. But arguably, it's better than nothing, and there was one song I actually even kind of liked. There, I said it, I like something about the game. Visuals are extremely basic and repetitive, and most of them look like they just use some sort of low-poly cyberpunk asset pack like the kind I've seen sold on Humble Bundle so many times. Yet despite this, the game stutters almost constantly, maintaining a good enough frame rate but somehow never feeling smooth. What I found most intriguing was the loading screens though, which were brief enough to barely register what you just saw, while being strange enough to make you want to record some footage and pause just to get a better look. First of all, at least one of them has a Hunter S. Thompson quote in it, which is just hilarious. But then there's the one where a guy's face looks like a zoomed in version of itself suffering from bad Photoshop syndrome, or the one that looks like a dog with the head of a man, apparently named the multi-dimensional pimp, whatever that means. The rest of the visual design is less strange and more generic, full of neon signs and an abundance of mirrored floors and a crucifix for some reason. Okay, yeah, maybe some of it is a little strange. And at long last, we've come far enough. It's time to just say the thing that I've been wanting to say, the odd theme that seemingly connects the haphazard visual design, bizarrely juvenile attempts at humor, weird gameplay ideas, and writing that would embarrass a 12-year-old. And that is this. Death Noodle Delivery is such an atrociously bad game that it feels like what basic AI-generated games might one day look like. The artwork for the loading screens is so random that I legitimately wondered if it was just made through an AI image generator, though obviously I have no idea if it's that or just bad photoshopping. And the gameplay is so basic, the challenges and basic structure so repetitive and poorly conceived that I could not comprehend what inspired someone to make a game and put so little care into it. While Death Noodle Delivery has some bugs, like one that spawned Jimmy 3 feet above the floor of his apartment and required me to reload the game, they are pretty infrequent and the game was mostly stable from beginning to end. I'm not awarding brownie points for a game not being broken because it's 2024 and it's time to establish a minimum set of expectations for these things, but Death Noodle Delivery is almost perfectly playable from beginning to end. It also works well on the Steam Deck if for some godforsaken reason you wanted to untether its experience from your PC and have it follow you around. I could give plenty more examples of ridiculously awful design choices that make this game such a chore, but frankly, I think I've made my point. Death Noodle Delivery is not a bad game, it is an abysmal one. A lazy, pointless useless piece of shovelware spruced up just enough to have a Steam page, released with as little actual content as could seemingly be gotten away with, and aggressively padded with time-wasting bullshit to stretch itself thinner like a baker filling his chocolate chip cookies with 80% sawdust and hoping his customers won't notice the difference. It is devoid of any meaningful reasons to play it regardless of your genre of choice, and the fact that it's releasing for any money at all is a brazen insult to anybody who owns a wallet. I may not be exactly mincing words here, but ensuring our audience doesn't waste money on games like this is part of what makes being a critic feel meaningful. Do yourself a favor and forget about the existence of Death Noodle Delivery the moment this video is over, and may a figurative god have mercy on its complete lack of soul. Death Noodle Delivery, more than any game I've ever reviewed, gets a most well-deserved indie Krampus.
Uh-oh.